with that, I think we will go ahead and get started. As I've mentioned, if you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from and perhaps how you are using ROR or planning to use ROR. Love to hear that. And as Maria mentioned, we do have a very international group today. Here's what we're going to be discussing today. Those of you who have attended these calls before will know roughly how it goes. We're welcoming you now. We'll give you some brief general updates about what's going on with ROR, and then we'll give you updates from each of the major areas of ROR. So we'll talk to you about ROR data curation, meaning changes and additions to the actual ROR data. We'll tell you a little bit about what's new in ROR's tech. I'll give you some updates on who's adopting ROR and who is planning to adopt ROR. And then we have two presentations from featured ROR users. The first one from Martyn Rittman of Crossref, who's going to tell us about Crossref's ability to accept ROR IDs for funders. And we're also going to hear from Tara Packer of Chorus about how Chorus uses ROR. And then we'll have, we should have a fair amount of time for questions and answers. And we always love to hear from you about anything new you're doing with ROR, new features, new integrations. We'd love to do that. Oh, we already have some in the chat as well. I wanted to do just a very brief introduction to ROR. Maybe you can mention in the chat as well if this is your first call. I noticed from the registrants that we do have a number of first-time attendees this time. So for many of you, this will be old information. But ROR, as you probably know if you are on this call, is a global community-led registry of open persistent identifiers for research and funding organizations. ROR is operated as a collaborative initiative, a project, not an organization, which is why ROR does not itself have its own ROR ID, by three organizations: the California Digital Library, Crossref, and DataCite, as part of each organization's ongoing operational budget. Core resourcing is supplemented with support from contributing organizations. So we have a number of ROR supporters, ROR sustaining supporters who do contribute to help ROR keep the lights on. We do not depend on grants or fees, and ROR cannot be transferred to a commercial entity. For those of you who are familiar with the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, to which Crossref and DataCite are also signatories, you may want to take a look at those. ROR is also very committed to those principles, and specifically the lack of dependence on grants and not being able to be transferred to a commercial entity are key parts of POSI. About these calls, we hold these every other month. So the next one will be in May. This is just a chance for you to tell us what you're thinking about ROR, as well as for us to give you an update on what we're up to. We announce them on our website and on the ROR Community Forum. We encourage you to ask us questions in the chat in particular. This is not a webinar, this is a meeting. If you would like to, in fact, unmute and say something, usually in the end at the Q&A, you're free to do that. You can raise your hand in Zoom, anything like that, but we encourage you to talk to one another in the chat and ask us questions. We will monitor that and respond as best we're able. We do record the calls, and we do share the recording and the slides, not only with those who have registered, but openly on our website and on our YouTube channel afterward. And that's usually available within a few days of when the call ends. We do ask you to abide by our code of conduct. Perhaps somebody can post that link in the chat. It's pretty standard. And then if you are joining from another country and would like to see captions for what we talk about, of course, we do hold these calls in English, but you're welcome to turn on captions in Zoom to see translations, or if you like, English captions. If you'd like to get involved beyond these calls, you're welcome to submit feature requests and bug reports on our roadmap. You can join our community forum to get updates and announcements, and even to discuss things about ROR if you like. We do also have a technical forum that is for more in the weeds technical discussions of ROR, and we do announce when the ROR registry is updated on the technical forum. You can, of course, submit a curation request to have a record changed or a record added. And you can also tell us about how you're planning to use ROR. All right, so we don't have much in the way of general updates for you, but I did just want to highlight a few events that ROR is planning to organize and or attend coming up. We are co-organizing a webinar with ORCID. They have an entire series about how ORCID works with other initiatives, especially in other identifiers. So on April 16th, we're holding a Better Together webinar in conjunction with ORCID. ORCID's Tom Demerenville will also be presenting there, and we'll talk about how ROR and ORCID work together. We're going to give a presentation at EuroCRIS. This will be an online presentation, although the event will be happening in Belgium. ROR and CRIS systems is something I'm very, very interested in. We know quite a bit about it, but I would love to learn more about how other CRIS systems are using ROR or are thinking of using ROR. So that will be in May. If you're planning to attend that event, please let us know. We'll be at SSP in Baltimore at the end of May. We'll be at Open Repositories in Chicago in July. And of course, as I mentioned, we do have upcoming bi-monthly ROR Community Calls. So if you have not already registered for those, feel free to visit our events page at ror.org/events and pre-register for those. And of course, I'm sure that other events will come up as the year progresses. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Riley Marsh, who is our metadata manager, and then to Adam Buttrick, and they can tell you about ROR Curation. Riley?
Hi, everybody. I'm Riley Marsh, as Amanda said, and I'm here with a little update on ROR Curation. I'm actually super excited to share that our the curation request volume is at a record high. So we're now exceeding 1,000 user-submitted requests per month, which is a level of enthusiasm and engagement that is truly unprecedented in the history of ROR Curation. So this surge is driven in a large part by the bulk submissions from many institutional, domain-focused, and regional initiatives, as well as some great continued organic growth from our amazing global community of users. As you know, we're committed to maintaining our high standards of quality and completeness for ROR data, even as this volume increases. So I wanted to take a moment to thank you all for your patience while we balance these concerns and we work our way through the backlog. But thank you so much. And that's it. I wanted to hand it over to Adam to discuss our other ongoing curation work.
Yeah, thanks, Riley. So on the curation projects front, we've made significant progress on several of the key initiatives that we discussed at our annual meeting. We recently added approximately 1,800 new records for Japanese research organizations based on some national level registry data that provided to us by the National Institute of Science and Technology Policy, or NISTEP. You might hear us refer to them as NISTEP. This data has allowed us to greatly improve our coverage for Japan, but it also includes many society organizations in the country, helping us to address not one, but two of the priority areas we're focusing on for 2025. So we want to thank the NISTEP team once again for all of their work and providing us with this fantastic resource. Like ROR, they maintain this really high quality, very well described, very thorough registry of Japanese research organizations that we can then leverage to make more better. On a similar note, we're also wrapping up our review of Portuguese research organizations, which has been a collaborative effort between ROR and the Foundation of Society and Technology in Portugal, or FCT. To kind of encourage comprehensive and accurate representation of research organizations in the country. Their team has also been a truly invaluable resource in helping us to better describe the Portuguese research landscape. So we're grateful to them as well for all of their support. We hope to have these published, these records for Portuguese research organizations, in the next couple months. Last but not least, our funder registry reconciliation work continues to advance as we pursue the funder registry's deprecation and replacement with ROR. We have 2 staff working on this project right now, one focused on general reconciliation and another specifically focused on Chinese funding organizations, which require both language and domain expertise to correctly describe. We'll be incorporating that work into our regular release cycle as it's completed. As always, none of this is possible without all of you and your continued engagement with ROR, your curation requests, your feedback, all the participation that you bring help us to better describe the global research ecosystem. So thank you to everyone for being a part of our work and to continuously improve ROR's data. Oh, Katya, hi. I see Katya on here. Yeah, Katya is from FTC and is the great resource that I was talking about.
Hello, thank you very much for the update. And these are great news, Adam. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I think we're next going to hear from our tech lead, Liz Krasnarich, about what's going on in ROR Tech. Liz?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So for the new folks, yes, my name is Liz Krasnarich. I am ROR's technical lead and lead developer. This time around, especially for those who have been here before, I don't have too many new updates, but that is because we are working diligently on some of the work that we have talked about previously. So the last few months, we spent a lot of time gathering feedback and talking about the prospect of adding some API client identification capabilities into our ROR ecosystem to allow us to manage traffic there a little bit more easily. There was a whole community input process around that that we came up with the final version of a few months ago, and we're underway on that work of developing the form for registering client identifiers and also the backend bits and pieces needed to run that. So we're still trucking along on time as planned with our preview kind of beta version available end of Q1, beginning of Q2. It's we're not going to be applying any rate limiting based on presence or absence of client identifiers at that point, but we will be releasing it for people to test out. And our plan is still that at the end of 2025, to align with the API version 1 sunset, we will start applying rate limiting based on the presence or absence of a valid client ID, and we'll be putting out much more information as we launch that client ID registration process. I added a slide in here that goes through kind of the background information. This is more for folks who haven't been here before. We started this work on API client identification and rate limiting way back in August of 2024 and went through a couple of community feedback rounds and put together the final proposal, which you can look at with the links that are available in the meeting notes and in these slides. But really the outcome of that is that ROR API users should register a client ID once that system is available, and they will need to include it in a header in their API request to receive the current rate limit of 2,000 requests per 5 minutes. Once we add in the rate limiting portion, and again, this is not until the end of 2025, then requests without a valid client ID will receive a much lower rate limit of 50 requests per 5 minutes. And this is, again, just to balance and manage traffic in the API to keep our services healthy and sustainable for everyone. It's not intended to limit access to the API. There's no actual login feature. We're not talking about differential, paid tiers of service. It's just giving us a little better control to manage traffic. And that's it. We're just continuing work on that. I do want to put a reminder in about the schema and API version 1 sunset. We've been talking about this for a good long time since we launched the version 2 API back in March of 2024. So it's been out for more than a year at this point. We have talked all along about the fact that we are going to sunset and deprecate version 1. We have some documents about our versioning process. It states that we'll give at least a year before sunsetting a given version, and we're now past a year, and we're going to give it 9 more months to the end of 2025. So all that is to say, if you're using the ROR API and you're not using version 2 yet, please take a look at the documentation and get started on switching over to version 2. There's a brief summary of all the changes in version 2 that's in this changelog, but all of our documentation is available in version 2 in great detail. And if you have any questions, you can contact us at support@ror.org. And I just have a little quick infographic showing what we are seeing in terms of request versions in our API. It's holding pretty steady at about a third of them coming in version 2, most of them still coming in with no version, which makes sense because the ROR API was not versioned before we developed this versioning process and launched version 2. And so an important thing to keep in mind is that we currently have the default API version set at version 1. So for those requests that come in with no specified version, and we will be switching that likely middle or later of this year to version 2. So those no version requests, the response that you get back will change as we march toward the sunsetting of version 1. And we'll be making more announcements about that exact timing as we get further into it. And that's it for me.
Liz, there are a couple of questions in the chat. I think we're doing pretty well on time, so maybe you could address those now. Arthur asks about stats on the CloudFront errors that some of us have seen off and on. Adam has done an initial response to that, but anything to say about CloudFront errors?
CloudFront errors related. So we have, I mean, offhand, I'm not sure exactly what these errors are. So we have a couple of applications that run on CloudFront. The API is not one of them.
So Arthur is referring to in the ROR UI actually during periods of high or errant traffic, which I was mentioning. We can sometimes see degradations in the specific ROR UI. It doesn't generally affect the API availability or services. It's just in our public-facing application layer.
So that is one of the applications that runs on CloudFront. So yeah, we see we are working behind the scenes on a couple of other projects that aren't super interesting to largely to this group because we are aware. I mean, the client ID stuff plays into it. What basically is happening when you see those CloudFront errors is that there is a lot of traffic hitting at a specific time altogether in the API, and that will cause temporary slowdowns in the API. We actually, I was looking at the data for the last couple of months. We have an unusually high number of applications scheduled to run at 10 minutes after the hour every hour, and that was causing some interesting things to happen to other people's requests that were hitting exactly at that time, in that an application could be sending requests all day long, and like suddenly at 10 minutes after the hour, they would start seeing some latency and occasional like 500 errors due to other stuff going on in other people's usage. And so that's in part, this client ID stuff is intended to address. The other things that we are working on and that I'm doing right now that's boring behind the scenes is working much harder on caching because we see a lot of the same requests over and over and over again in the API. So I'm trying to reduce some of that traffic that in the API that is then affecting the user interface, because it's all the same thing under the hood. So
yeah, one of the things I think we're really excited about this client ID is that when somebody is sending a lot of unnecessary traffic to the ROR API, this will enable us to contact them and say, please stop, which right now we can't do. The only thing we could do is block IP addresses, which is kind of a last ditch response to.
Yeah, so the question, one solution is to partition the API serving the UI versus the API. Yeah, I mean, that is a potential future option. We do need to solve, issues surrounding balancing traffic in the API generally. So my thinking was to kind of hit some of that first before introducing a little bit more complication by splitting off the onto a separate load balancer, the stuff for the user interface. We also, in terms of looking at priorities, the bulk of the traffic is much higher in the API versus the UI sees pretty limited traffic, which is not to say it's not important. It just maintaining stability in the API is something that is overall good for all the services. But it is correct that we could partition off the kind of replica API for just serving the UI. It does introduce some complications in our curation and deployment process that we would have to certainly think about.
Well, Liz, I see another question from Fabiano in the chat, but I'll let you reply to that in the chat so that we don't take up too much time. And Fabiano, we could also take that up again in the Q&A or offline. We can email you, you can email us. But meanwhile, let's go on and talk about ROR adoption, which is me. So I wanted to mention a couple of notable recent and upcoming ROR adoptions. Crossref now accepts ROR IDs for funder identifiers, which we are going to hear more about from Crossref's Martyn Rittman in just a few minutes. As usual, there's a little caveat to this that sometimes we learn about integrations quite a while after they have occurred. So some of these are new to us integrations. Highwire Press, which is quite a large provider of publishing systems and solutions, as well as a publisher in its own right, has a tool called DigitCore Pro, which I only learned at the annual meeting, does have a ROR integration. They have other tools. They have a DigitEdit XML editing tool that enables ROR. So I've got a request out to learn more about that integration. I'm hoping we can get Tony Alvis from Highwire to tell us more about what that is and how it works. But I'm excited about that. We have Ramazan on the call with us today. Thanks to some great correspondence with Ramazan about using ROR in Turkey's publishing systems. We now have a ROR integration in Turkey's national publishing system, Ulekbim Journal Systems. And so we're grateful to him for making that happen. And there may be additional integrations that happen with that coming up. We're expecting a couple of very major publishing related ROR integrations to happen quite soon, like within, I would say, probably the next 2 to 6 months. Open Journal Systems version 3.5 is coming out, and that has really wonderful ROR support built in so that the affiliations for contributors to OJS journals not only can be managed within OJS, which is currently possible for previous versions with a plugin, but also can be sent to Crossref in metadata, which earlier versions of OJS are not currently able to do. So that's very exciting, and we're looking forward to that. As we mentioned again at the annual meeting, Adapon, which is a major publishing platform service provider, is in the process of supporting ROR IDs for author affiliations, and again, being able to send those to Crossref. What we've heard is that many Adapon users, Adapon is a platform that is used by many publishers. We've heard that many publishers are using ROR IDs, but they're not getting through to Crossref and Crossref metadata because Adapon has not yet upgraded to the Crossref schema that supports ROR. So that is happening quite soon, and I expect that to be a very large uptick in ROR IDs in Crossref metadata once that happens. So very excited about that. If you are interested in learning more or telling us more, please let us know. So I usually give charts about ROR in Crossref, DataCite, and ORCID. And so today is no differently. We're so close to 200,000 ROR IDs in Crossref metadata. Looking forward to that milestone. And again, this is over the course of 3 years. I've mentioned this too. Originally, most of the ROR IDs, we're talking about 2022 or so, a few years ago, most of the ROR IDs in Crossref metadata were actually affiliated with grants, partly because Wellcome was registering grants with Crossref, and EMBL was making sure that those got through into Crossref metadata. But now, as is to be expected, more publishers are using ROR IDs, especially for author affiliations. And so most item types that have ROR IDs in Crossref are journal articles. But we do have other item types where ROR IDs are used, usually for either, in the case of grants, it's sort of principal investigator affiliations, reports, dissertations and theses, posted content, which is often blog posts and peer reviews. The top 10 contributors of ROR IDs to Crossref metadata: eLife, always a really good citizen in terms of metadata. Optica, we have representatives of Optica here today. Wellcome, as I mentioned, American Physical Society, Natural Resources Canada, and so on. Data site records with ROR IDs in affiliations is over 19 million right now. You'll see a big spike there a few months ago. That was from one entity, the Japanese National Institute for Fusion Sciences. Data site records with ROR IDs in funding is now over 600,000. Data site records with ROR IDs in the publisher element is now over 17 million. And what's interesting about that is ROR is almost the only identifier that is used for publishers in data site metadata. There are a few other identifiers that account for, I think, less than 5% of records with an identifier at all. But this is a fairly recent addition to the data site schema. And of course, publisher in data site records means something somewhat different than it does in Crossref. These are often repositories, and the organization that runs the repository is usually considered the publisher, but it's still a nice statistic to see. ORCID records, at some point, I think I will stop tracking ROR IDs in ORCID records, but that day is not today. At some point, I think ORCID is going to just standardize on ROR IDs for all organization identifiers. But for now, they've done a lot of really fantastic UI work in particular to encourage the use of ROR IDs for educational attainments and employment and things like that. And we did, so over 4 million ORCID records now include a ROR ID in any of the multiple kinds of ways an ORCID record can mention an organization. And one nice little milestone is that now over 50% of ORCID records have at least one ROR ID in them. So we've got over, but at some point it will be 100% or 99%. And at that point, I will stop showing you these charts. Just as we don't show them for OpenAlex, because basically every organization in OpenAlex pretty much has a ROR ID. So this is great. And now I'm going to turn things over to Martyn Rittman of Crossref, who is going to tell us a little bit about a very exciting new feature that Crossref has launched, ROR for funder identification. Martyn?
Yeah, great to be here. Great to speak to everyone. It's not that often I've attended these ROR community calls, and it's really nice to participate and see the uptake and the increase in numbers. Hopefully, we can encourage that even more. Yeah, if you can go on to the next slide. Probably skip the next one. So yeah, this is the message. If you want to kind of zone out for the next few minutes, this is the message. So you can deposit and retrieve ROR IDs in the same place that you can do for funder IDs. So just to kind of dig into that a little bit more on the next slide, what that means. So funder IDs are open identifiers. They're part of the Open Funder Registry, and they are actually DOIs. And as the name suggests, they're identifiers for funding organizations. And since I think it was about 18 months ago, we kind of took the decision that we will eventually switch from funder IDs to preferring ROR IDs. And there's a few reasons for doing that. So firstly, any funder can have a ROR ID as well. Yeah, obviously not all organizations that have a ROR ID would have a funder ID, because they're, the funders are a subset of organizations with ROR IDs. So that means it's a simplification. Instead of two parallel systems of identification, we can just use one. And the other thing which is really important to us, and there's more in the blog post that I've linked at the bottom, maybe I can link in the chat in a few minutes, is around the kind of governance and curation of ROR. It's just a little bit more transparent, and we think it fits better with kind of open infrastructure and how things are managed. So yeah, going on to the next slide, please, Amanda. Thanks. So what does that mean in practice? Sorry if this is a little bit technical. I'm trying to kind of cover a broad audience here. So if you are a Crossref member and you're depositing XML, then you'll be familiar with something like what's on the top left here. This is how you put funding information into your records when you deposit metadata with Crossref. So you put in, there's a fund group, and I think you've skipped a slide. There should be, so one before then? Yeah, a few slides. Sorry, go up a couple. That's there you go. No, that's still the same one. There should be one which has a funder ID. Go up. Oh yeah, this is it. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, there's been Zoom gremlins today, so I can't control the slides myself. But anyway.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
This is so this is what you'll see in the output at the moment. You'll see funding information. So if you go into our REST API and you maybe look at a journal article, you'll see in the metadata, this is JSON formatted data. You'll see this funder section, and in the funder you can see in the DOI field a DOI, and this is a funder ID for the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. But if you go into the ROR registry, you'll see there is an entry for the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. It's got a nice shiny ROR ID. And then if you can see it, maybe a little bit small, but on the bottom right, you'll see actually the Crossref funder ID is listed within the ROR record there. So we know that these are actually identical organizations. So it would be possible to replace this funder ID with the ROR ID. And that's what we would like organizations to do. But until now, it hasn't been possible to deposit that information. We've only accepted funder IDs. We haven't accepted ROR IDs. You can carry on. So yeah, this is what we would like to do in the future. So in the funding metadata that's deposited, so what's in the top left here is XML, which our members deposit. Some of you may never see this because you're using some kind of editorial system, but this is essentially what gets sent to us. And there's the funding information is in this FundRef group, and in the fund group you have an institution and an award number. And the institution can now have a ROR ID. And then you see on the bottom right, we've got something which looks like this is the output that you can see in our REST API, what gets kind of spit out the other side once we process the data. We have, again, the funding section with the award number, and then you'll see the ID, which has a type of ROR, and you'll see that that's a ROR ID there. Yeah, so that's now an alternative option to using funder IDs. So if you go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So there's just a few caveats around this. So the first one is around the use of fund groups. And it's maybe a slightly technical point. We had a lot of discussion internally about what it means if you add two identifiers in a single fund group. And we decided that should be interpreted as two separate funders for the same grant. What I would recommend is avoiding that complication. And if you're depositing with XML, just use one funder and one award combination. So if you've got maybe an award which is supported by two funders, you put those just in two separate fund groups. if that kind of goes over your head, don't worry. It's kind of a technical point, just in case you are thinking of implementing this using XML. I guess another point is that the raw IDs that we're collecting don't require a name, and we're not accepting a name for the funder. We're just accepting the raw ID. And the reason for this is that previously, when organizations, when our members have sent us the funder ID and the name, they often don't correspond, or we're getting various different names for the same funder ID. And this is just kind of confusing, and it's difficult to determine what the accurate name is. So we're asking for just the raw ID. And at the moment, we're not displaying the name in the REST API on the output side. It's something you might want to comment on if that's something that you would find really useful. If it is useful, then I think we would look at maybe pulling that information in from the raw registry. But at the moment, we just want to basically use the identifier and rely on the identifier as much as possible. And then the kind of final caveat to mention here is that nearly but not quite all funder registry items have a raw ID, and this is quite intentional. And I know it's something that Adam has looked into quite extensively, and it goes back to what I said about the curation of the funder registry. At some point in time, it was decided that funding programs could also have a funder ID, not just funding organizations. And so there's a relatively small number of funder IDs which refer to funding programs and not funding organizations, and those don't have a raw ID. So what if that's an issue, then what we recommend, or if you're an organization that's been using those funder IDs for funding programs, there are different ways you can represent funding programs in the metadata. And we're going to produce some guidance about how to do that, and some kind of best practice guidelines for our members. So yeah, moving on. There should be one more slide before that, I think. Yeah. So what's next? A couple of things that we're kind of doing next in this area. So first, as I said, we're producing some recommendations on metadata for funding programs. And we're going to work with our community to get our members to switch from using funder IDs to RORs, see maybe what the blockers are, particularly work with some of the large platforms, editorial systems, because as I think we heard earlier with Atipon, when there's uptake from some of the larger editorial systems, that can move the needle quite significantly. Another part of this work is about matching. So very often, particularly with author affiliations, we have just a string of the author affiliation, and we can match those to raw IDs. And Adam, I think, and one of my colleagues, Dominica, have been involved in prototyping some work and doing some research about that. I think there's a blog post coming maybe in the next couple of weeks, and rather a large data dump as well. So that's something to get excited about. That's the kind of research part of it. We need to then at some point integrate that into our production services, and that will take a little bit of time. But yeah, the message is we want to match strings to RORs and have those RORs appearing in our metadata. And then, yeah, as I think has already been mentioned, at some point we want to deprecate the funder registry. What that means, that doesn't mean we're going to delete it and no one's going to be able to use it and you won't see funder IDs. What that means is that at some point we'll take the decision to stop updating the funder registry and not add new items to that. You will still be able to use funder IDs. We need quite a period of time for our members to be able to switch to using raw IDs. And then at some point, eventually, maybe 5-10 years, I don't know, we'll perhaps replace the funder IDs in our database with raw IDs where that's possible. Yeah. So then, final slide is a kind of a message, I guess, especially to any members. Send us your funding metadata. We'd love to have more of it. and use ROR IDs when you do that. Yeah. I can see a couple of questions. Should I answer those quickly or
Yeah, let's answer those quickly. If you can see those. I think one is a bit more of a comment about the ROR funder name, and then
Yeah.
Julie has a question about Crossmark as well.
Yeah, sure. So, okay. Yeah, I mean, it's just useful. It's useful to know that there's people who would like to see that. If anyone wants to +1 that comment, then, that gives us an indication of other people that are interested in that as well. Will funders are deposited with ROR be displayed in the Crossmark updates metadata panel? We don't have plans to do that at the moment. Although it may be, I'm not quite sure. That depends how Crossmark is working, because I think the funder IDs are displayed there. I'm not sure whether the ROR IDs will show up or not. That will be something that I'd have to check. It may happen automatically. But yeah, I would have to check on that, unless I saw a couple of colleagues on the call. If anyone knows the answer to that, stick it in the chat or speak up.
And Daniel, I'll address Daniel's question really quickly before we move on to hearing from Chorus. Daniel asks if anyone has an example of a journal article that lists a ROR in the funding metadata. We do. They're all fake. They're all testing DOIs, because no one is actually doing this yet. But I will, perhaps while you're presenting, Tara, I'll grab a couple of those and show you. I'll put them in the chat, Daniel. I wanted to mention too, I put in our general guide to the funder ID to ROR transition. We probably have a bit of documentation updating to do as well at ROR. But I wanted to mention, if any of you would like to try to implement this, you're thinking about looking at depositing ROR IDs in Crossref metadata where you were previously depositing funder IDs, we would love to work with you, like at every step of the process. I think that's true for both Crossref and ROR.
Yeah, 100%.
So, literally put it in the chat, email us at support@ror.org, or, email Martyn, and I think we'd be happy to work with you. Yep. All right, and a few more questions, especially about OJS in the chat. But I think before we address those, and we can always address them at the end of the session as well, we'll hear from Tara Packer at Chorus. Tara?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So I do want to say thank you to Amanda and the ROR team for allowing Chorus to give an update. Some of you already know about Chorus, but for those that don't, I just want to give you a little bit of background, and then also touch on what Chorus is doing with RORs and why. So Chorus, if you want to go ahead and go forward on the slides. So Chorus is a nonprofit community effort to help reduce the burden of complying with open and public access mandates. So we're all about creating a future where the output flowing from funded research is easily and permanently discoverable, accessible, and verifiable. We help our stakeholders, publishers, institutions, and funders primarily scale their OA compliance and improve quality of their metadata. And I think that that's really a key, is improving the quality of the metadata related to the open research. So we do this in a variety of ways. We provide dashboards. We also, along with those dashboards, reports and APIs. We connect a variety of PIDs. You want to go ahead and move forward. If I'm going too fast, let me know. The PIDs, Chorus deals with a lot of PIDs in addition to RORs. So when I say deal with it, we ingest a lot of the PIDs that publishers and others collect and then deposit to the likes of Crossref and DataCite. Our primary PID is around funders, and has been the funder ID and the funder name, that combination, so that way we can have both metadata attributes to verify, as Martyn touched on, and I'll touch on as well. There are a lot of, I don't want to say errors, but a lot of issues around funding metadata. But we also collect metadata about whether the article is archived for preservation, whether it's a preprint and it's deposited at a repository, whether an article is appearing in an agency portal such as the NSF PAR system, and as well as grant information and ORCID IDs and such. So we collect a lot of PIDs. Next slide. So as I said, the main PID for Chorus is a funder ID and funder name. Everything we do revolves around funding metadata. It's important for Chorus to integrate with ROR IDs for a variety of reasons, and we've been doing so with RORs for affiliations. We've been collecting that for a long time, ever since they started. And as in Martyn's last slide, we touched on, we don't quite have any real examples of RORs for funders. However, we do have some of our publisher members who have put it into their systems and processes. We just don't have a real example to show. So with all of those PIDs that we collect, we do provide dashboards, reports, and APIs to our stakeholders. Next slide. Want to touch on, this is a visual of our NASA dashboard. And if you can click forward, there should be a little bit of animation here. There we go. So what we've been doing in the meantime, while our publishers are busily trying to get their systems in place for collection of ROR IDs for funding, we've been connecting with with the ROR registry. So that helps us also in verifying whether the metadata provided is accurate. If it isn't, then we end up going back to the publisher and asking for corrections to be made with the Crossref deposits, or if it's in a data site deposit. See the next, I think we can push forward. This is a one previous, sorry. So what I wanted to do is touch on, because we've been collecting RORs as well as funder IDs, we do provide an index to our publisher members so that way they can keep track of the requirements, their agreements, their Chorus agreements with the funders that we participate with. So they want to make sure that they're collecting and properly recording for all of the Chorus funding participants or funder participants. Want to go to the next slide. So these are, again, not real examples. The top screenshot is from an AI example. I'm still a proponent of having a name associated with the ID, mostly for verification process or validating something. We get a number of, or see a number of records that, I'm going to use NSF. I pick on NSF a lot because it's a great example of what can go wrong. There are a number of funding organizations that use the acronym NSF, or they'll use National Science Foundation, and they really meant National Sleep Foundation or National Science Foundation of Sri Lanka. So with the systems, in particular, the manuscript tracking systems that are connected to the registries, those drop-down menus are easy to make a mistake in. And so we find a number of records that we have to go back and notify the publisher, as part of that investigation, we're looking at the article, the acknowledgement section, to see if the author has identified a grant that will help us say whether that record is real or that reference is really for NSF in the US, or is it another NSF? So, and then the example I have on the bottom is from the Crossref documentation. of for the metadata outline in the schema. Did want to just give both examples, but again, I'm a big advocate for having a name as well, but only to help make sure that that record is reporting properly. I'm going to go to the next slide. So it's going to take a village, like anything else, or everything, I should say. Researchers going to need to make sure that they are identifying the correct funding in their submissions, whether that be through manuscript tracking systems or whether that be in the acknowledgement sections, or there might be a request for a separate funding section in their submissions. Manuscript tracking systems, as I noted earlier, the vendors need to make sure that there are standard utilities to use and that they're stable. So that way the proper funding can be collected. And then publishers making sure that they're using those standard utilities. I mean, I know that we have some publishers that have their own systems that they use, but you know, and that's fine. It's just make sure it's a very stable system so that way we can correctly record the proper metadata and PIDs. Yeah, so I kind of went through everything pretty quickly, but Chorus won't be able to do what we do for our stakeholders if the funding isn't properly recorded and the affiliation isn't properly recorded. Having those pieces of metadata are extremely important to not just Chorus, but to everyone, and making sure that the right attributions are being yeah, so.
Thank you very much, Tara. Great to hear. We do have a few minutes left for questions, and I, for one, can stay a few minutes past the hour. I did want to address a couple of things that are in the chat. First of all, there has been quite a bit of quite a few questions about OJS in particular. That has been a focus of ours for the last few years. And I'm going to put a link in the chat here to a very recent webinar about the forthcoming new version of Open Journal Systems 3.5, which has excellent support for ROR. For those of you who do use Open Journal Systems, version 3.3, which was released a few years ago, is the current long-term support version, which means that it's the current version that people recommend to use. There are earlier versions of OJS that are still in use. Those earlier versions, really anything before 3.0, can't deposit metadata to Crossref at all. So 3.3 and 3.4 both have a ROR plugin that people can use to use ROR IDs internally, which does have some utility, but those versions of OJS are not able to put that ROR ID into Crossref metadata. So the forthcoming version of 3.5, when it is released, which I believe is in a couple of months, will become the long-term support version of OJS, meaning the recommended version. So once people, and the newer versions are much easier to upgrade than the earlier versions. So we do anticipate a lot of additional ROR use specifically for contributor affiliations coming from those. Funding is also managed by a plugin in OJS, and currently that plugin uses funder IDs. One important point that I'm always stressing to people is that funder IDs are DOIs, which means that they are persistent. And this is a very long-term, well, it's quite a long-term project, switching from funder IDs to ROR IDs. So, you know, for those of you who have built workflows and processes on funder IDs, both Crossref and ROR are really committed to making sure that that is a smooth transition, that you have all of the time in the world to make that transition, and the same is true for that OJS plugin. The other thing I wanted to address is a question about Scholar One and add upon. So I believe it was Julie, who asked, or no, so Katie Yancey. Our journals are on the Adapon platform, and we're working towards adopting ROR now that the platform can deposit to Crossref. Our challenge is figuring out a smooth way to collect the ROR IDs in the first place, as our submission platform, Scholar One, doesn't support ROR collection. Good news, we have been talking with Scholar One for quite a while. Scholar One, as you probably know, was recently acquired by Silverchair. I want to share a link to a recent post that's about Scholar One. Silverchair has been very, very forthcoming with the kinds of things they are trying to do for, I think this has the, for Scholar One, things that they are trying to do to support the platform. Suffice it to say that we have had very encouraging conversations with Scholar One. Scholar One, like Adapon, is a major platform. Getting ROR built into these major publishing platforms is going to be the things that makes those numbers in Crossref shoot up. For a lot of these platforms, it's been on the roadmap, sometimes for a couple of years. And I think this year, one thing I personally want to do is make sure to collect a lot of input from people who use those systems and sort of coordinate it to make sure that these platforms adopt ROR sooner rather than later. But Adapon should be forthcoming. Publishing workflows are often really complex. They have lots of different systems. Many publishers are using ROR at one point in their workflow, but it's not getting through to the Crossref metadata because that's a whole different system, or that's typesetting or whatever. I see Tara nodding. I see Washington nodding, So, our goal is to make those numbers in Crossref go up, but those numbers in Crossref are not indicative of the extent of ROR use among publishers, which is quite extensive. It's just invisible. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Katie. I would love to talk more about that offline. Any other questions? Open this up to you. Feel free to raise your hand or ask something in the chat. All right, if you're sure, last chance, last call. Thanks, Christiane. Our email is support@ror.org, one of our emails. So we can put you in touch with Tara or with Martyn, even if you find it more difficult to do that. And we will be sure to send you the slides and the recording. Thank you so much for attending, everybody.